They say a mother never forgets the sound her child makes when she arrives in the world. But the sound I remember most is the one she made when she left mine. Nothing. Not even footsteps. Just the soft thud of a cardboard box on my front porch and the whisper of a note sliding against the lid. "I'm not ready," she wrote. The letters slanted like she was afraid of them, as if readiness were something that could leap off the page and bite her. I stood there in my robe, barefoot, the night air carrying the smell of burnt sage from my neighbor's yard, and stared at the box like it was a trick of the moonlight. But then the baby inside shifted, made a small sound. Not a cry exactly, but a breathy, uncertain whimper. And that was when I knew this wasn't a dream or a cruel misunderstanding. My daughter had left her newborn child on my doorstep as if she were dropping off dry cleaning she had no intention of picking up. I remember whispering, "No, no, no," under my breath as I lifted the baby out, not because I didn't want her, but because the weight of her was so small, and yet the meaning was so enormous that my knees weakened. I had not been ready either, not for years, not since the day I realized my daughter had turned into a woman I no longer knew how to reach, a woman whose love slipped through her fingers the way sand slips through a fist. And yet here I was, holding the warm, fragile proof that she had given up before she had even tried. I am 74 now, and the walls of my little house in Taos hold more silence than visitors, more truth than apologies, and more memories than I sometimes know what to do with. People think age makes you gentle, softens your anger, rounds out your disappointments, but that is only half true. Age doesn't erase anything. It just rearranges the furniture inside you so that certain sorrows sit closer to the window and others retire to the back of your mind, where you visit them only when the night is too quiet to distract you. I live alone by choice, not loneliness, though people often confuse the two, and I let them, because explaining the difference exhausts me. My granddaughter, yes, the one from the box, is now 18, tall, fierce, with that slightly tilted smile that she must have inherited from me, because it certainly didn't come from her mother. She visits often, though not as often as she used to, caught between her own future and the weight of my past. I never ask her to choose. I learned long ago that asking someone to stay is the fastest way to push them toward the door. When I think back to that night, I can still feel the temperature of it, the way the cold bit into my ankles, the way the porch light flickered as if hesitating to witness what was happening. My daughter didn't knock. That part stings more than I admit. There was no moment of hesitation in which I could have opened the door and caught her in the act of abandoning her child. No trembling hand. No tear-filled eyes. No goodbye. Just that box, that note, and the soft grunt of a baby who had no idea she had already been declared too heavy a burden. I stood there longer than I should have, letting the baby's warmth seep into my chest, letting the enormity of it settle into my bones. I felt something rise in me, a mix of terror and resolve, like the way you feel when a storm sweeps across the mesa and you know the roof may not hold, but you brace for it anyway. Those early years were not easy. People romanticize the idea of grandparents raising grandchildren as if love alone can replace youthful energy or financial security, or the simple fact that your body does not obey you the way it once did. But I managed. I managed because I have always managed, even when life handed me responsibilities I had not asked for. And yet, I never forgot the truth. This child came to me not out of love or trust, but out of desperation, perhaps even indifference. That truth sat with me through every fever, every sleepless night, every scraped knee and school recital, a shadow in the corner of the room that I tried my best to ignore. And when people asked where the mother was, I had different answers depending on the day. Traveling, working, figuring things out. But the truth was that she was gone in a way that felt final, even before the court declared it so. In the quiet moments, I sometimes wondered if I had somehow failed her long before she failed her own child. Regret is a heavy thing when carried at my age. It presses down on the spine and steals the air from your lungs. But regret without context is just another form of cruelty, and I tried not to indulge in it too deeply. My daughter had always been someone who ran from discomfort, from responsibility, from any mirror that reflected her too clearly. And yet, even now, part of me wishes she had left a different note, one that said, "I tried," or "I'll come back," or even, "Forgive me." But all she wrote was, "I'm not ready," as if motherhood were a party she had been invited to but didn't feel like attending. That tiny sentence became a wound that never fully closed. A simple string of words that explained everything and nothing all at once. Still, life stabilized around us, the way water settles after being stirred. My granddaughter grew into the kind of girl who assessed the world carefully before stepping into it, her eyes always searching, always measuring. She asked about her mother when she was 5, then again at 9, and then at 14, when the questions turned sharper and carried the quiet accusation of a child realizing she had been left behind by someone she had never met. I told her the truth in small, manageable doses because pain, like medicine, must be given in the right amounts, or it harms more than it heals. She never resented me for it. If anything, she clung to me more tightly in those years, as if sensing that I had been the one constant in a story built on absences. And yet, even with all that history, I never expected my daughter to return. I never expected to see her face again, not after 18 years of silence. I certainly never expected her to arrive with a lawyer at her side, dressed like a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades polishing her life into something shiny enough to conceal its cracks. But expectations are the most fragile things we carry, and life loves to drop them from great heights. On the day she reappeared, the ground beneath my feet did not shake, but something inside me did. Something old and long buried, something I had protected for so many years that I had forgotten it needed protecting. I felt it stir, and I knew, with the same certainty I had felt the night she left her baby in that box, that nothing was ever simple with her, not even her return. I didn't know then what she wanted, not exactly, though the presence of the lawyer was its own kind of announcement. But even before she spoke, before she explained herself, before she laid out the reasons for her sudden reemergence, I felt a cold, familiar understanding settle over me. Whatever she had come for, she believed she had a right to it. And that, perhaps more than the box on the porch, was the deepest wound of all. I remember the exact moment when the truth stopped being a fog I could pretend not to see and instead became something solid enough to bruise me. It was 3 days after my daughter abandoned her baby on my porch, and I was still moving through the world like a woman who had slipped into a story she was not prepared to tell. My hands worked automatically, warming bottles, rinsing blankets, listening for every tiny breath from the bassinet, while my mind floated somewhere above me, circling around the question I didn't dare ask aloud. What kind of mother leaves her child in silence and disappears into the night without looking back? I kept telling myself she would call, that she would burst through the door in tears, apologizing, trembling, begging to hold the baby again, swearing she'd panicked, that she hadn't meant it, that she was just overwhelmed. Mothers do panic. Daughters do make mistakes. Desperation can make anyone unrecognizable for a moment. That was the hope I held in my chest like a fragile thing I was afraid to squeeze too tightly. But hope, as I've learned, is a slippery companion, faithful only until confronted with facts. The phone didn't ring. Her number stayed disconnected no matter how many times I called. I even drove past her old apartment, the one I'd helped her move into during a summer so hot the asphalt shimmered like water. The blinds were drawn, the mailbox jammed with circulars, the silence inside the stairwell carrying the faint echo of a life she had long since abandoned. A neighbor watering her succulents on the landing looked at me with cautious curiosity and said she hadn't seen my girl in weeks, maybe months. I thanked her and walked back to my car with the weight of a truth I wasn't ready to name tightening in my throat. That night, the baby slept with one tiny fist curled against her cheek, utterly trusting the world in its entirety, unaware that the world, meaning her mother, had already walked away. The next morning, a sharp knock rattled my front door, a sound too abrupt to be a friend and too impatient to be family. I opened it to find a woman wearing a county badge clipped to her shirt pocket and holding a clipboard that looked heavier than her expression allowed. She asked my name, asked if I had recently taken in a newborn, asked if I was the maternal grandmother. I could feel the cold edge of panic slide into my spine. I invited her inside, my voice steady only because I'd spent my life learning how to sound calm when my heart was buckling. The woman stepped into the living room and glanced around as if checking for signs of chaos or neglect. And then she looked at me with the particular softness of someone who has delivered this kind of news before and wishes she hadn't had to. She told me the hospital had reported an abandoned birth. A young woman had gone into labor at a walk-in clinic, given a false name, left within hours, and vanished before social workers could interview her. The description matched my daughter in age, in build, in hair color. The clinic had notified the authorities, who had been trying to locate the mother ever since. And then, 3 nights later, a baby matching the birth details had been reported by a neighbor, my neighbor, who had seen me picking up a cardboard box with something wrapped inside. I felt a flood of heat under my skin, something between shame and fury. I had wanted to shield my daughter's choice from the world, not out of loyalty but out of the instinct to keep private wounds from becoming public spectacle. But the world has its own ways of finding what people try to hide. The social worker, her name was Marisol, asked if she could see the baby. I led her down the hallway to the bedroom where the infant slept in a borrowed bassinet, swaddled in a floral blanket that had belonged to my daughter when she was a newborn. For a long moment, Marisol stood there quietly, observing the rising and falling of the baby's tiny chest, the way her lips puckered in sleep, as if searching for something she had already lost. Then she sighed, a soft, weary sound, and asked if I had any contact information for my daughter. I shook my head. She asked if my daughter had struggled with addiction or mental illness. I said no, though my voice faltered. She asked if my daughter had ever expressed fear or regret about the pregnancy. I thought about the way my daughter had avoided my eyes during the last weeks I'd seen her, the way she'd said, "I'm fine, just tired," in that careful tone people use when they are trying not to unravel. Marisol sat with me at the kitchen table, her clipboard resting between us like a quiet judge. She explained the procedure: temporary placement, investigation, assessment of the grandmother's capability to provide care. There were forms to sign, evaluations to schedule, financial assessments to undergo. I listened, nodding when required. But the only part that lodged itself in my chest was the phrase temporary placement. I wanted to tell her the placement was not temporary at all, that the moment I lifted that baby from the box, something ancient and immediate had awakened in me, something that felt like a vow. But I also knew the system didn't trust vows, only paperwork. Then came the question that scraped the inside of my throat raw. Had my daughter intended to return? Marisol asked it gently, but gentleness does not soften truth. I had no answer, none that didn't feel like betrayal. To my daughter if I said no, to my granddaughter if I pretended yes. I said I didn't know. It was the closest to honesty I could manage without breaking. Marisol closed her folder and looked at me with a mixture of professional distance and personal understanding. She said something that struck me hard. Sometimes the child is abandoned long before the baby is. I felt the meaning of it settle over the table like dust, familiar, uncomfortable, real. My daughter had started leaving long before that night. I had simply refused to see it. Before she left, Marisol placed a business card on the table and told me she would be back in 2 days. She paused at the doorway, her hand on the frame, and said she hoped I would consider legal guardianship. The baby needed stability, she said, a defined future, a home that wouldn't shift beneath her feet. I nodded, though I wasn't sure my voice would hold if I tried to speak. When the door closed, I leaned against it, breathing slowly, the way you do when the ground has shifted and you're trying to convince your legs they can still hold you. That afternoon, I sat in the rocking chair with the baby resting against my chest, her warmth grounding me, her scent something unbearably pure. I traced my fingers along the curve of her cheek, the soft fuzz on her head, the tiny unconscious fists that opened and closed in the rhythm of newborn dreams. I whispered a promise to her, not loud enough for the walls to judge me for saying it, but clear enough for my own heart to hear. I said that I wasn't ready either, not for motherhood the second time around, not for the judgments of neighbors, not for the questions that would never have answers. But I would do it anyway. I would be ready because someone had to be, and she was here, breathing and real, and needing someone who wouldn't vanish the moment responsibility pressed too hard. It was then, with the baby's heartbeat fluttering against my collarbone, that the truth settled into me with the weight of inevitability. My daughter wasn't coming back. Not for the baby. Not for me. Not for the life she had run from so many times that running had become her only way of staying afloat. The catalyst wasn't the box on the porch. The catalyst was the silence afterward, the widening distance that swallowed every hope I had held onto. I realized I had crossed a threshold without noticing, stepped into a role I had not chosen but could no longer refuse. I understood that from this moment on, everything would be different, and nothing, especially not love, would ever again feel as simple as it had before I found that note taped to the lid of a cardboard box. The slow unraveling began so quietly that, had I not been living inside it, I might have missed the way the threads loosened from one another, almost politely at first, as if the world were giving me time to adjust. In those early months after the social worker's visit, nothing dramatic happened. No sudden knocks at the door, no unexpected phone calls, no news of my daughter's whereabouts. Instead, life settled into a rhythm that looked calm from the outside, but carried inside it a constant low-grade tremor, the sort that makes you check the foundation of your house, even when the walls still look straight. The days took on a shape determined entirely by the needs of the baby, whose presence filled the rooms with sounds I had not heard in decades. The thin squeak of hunger, the uneven sighs of sleep, the startled crying that came from dreams babies have before they even understand the world. Yet every sound, every breath, reminded me that she was here because someone had walked away. It is difficult to resent a child for the choices of their parent, but it is not difficult to feel the weight of what those choices demand from you. I began to notice small changes in myself, subtle but steady, as if my old life, the quiet life I had carved out in the aftermath of my daughter's chaos, were dissolving grain by grain. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer trust. Meals were an afterthought. Conversations with neighbors became quick, polite exchanges, my eyes drifting constantly to the window, as if expecting someone to appear and challenge my right to raise the baby. The routines I had once relied on, morning walks, evening tea, afternoons spent repainting picture frames or pruning the sage bushes in the yard, fell away like leaves from a tree at the end of a season I hadn't realized was ending. When the follow-up visits from the county began, each one carried its own sort of quiet interrogation. The workers were kind enough, or at least professionally warm, but their eyes were always scanning, checking the cleanliness of the bottles, the organization of the drawers, the firmness of the crib mattress, the alignment of my answers with the notes in their folders. They smiled, but behind each smile was the unspoken question: can she handle this? I wanted to answer with something fierce and unwavering, but instead I found myself saying yes in a voice that sounded older than I remembered, a voice that understood that love does not always come with capability, and capability does not always come with recognition. The unspoken fear, of course, was that they might decide I wasn't enough, that they might choose someone else, someone younger, someone with steadier hands or better finances, or fewer shadows on their family tree. And then there were the quiet cruelties, the ones that weren't intentional, but landed with their own sharpness. A neighbor, meaning well, said she admired my bravery in taking on a baby at my age. Another asked whether the father might come back to claim her, as if this child were some misplaced package that might be retrieved by the rightful owner. Even the cashier at the grocery store, noticing the formula cans piling up in my cart, asked if I was watching the baby, just for a while. I didn't know how to explain that just for a while had already turned into a forever no one had prepared me for. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted stability, something predictable, something I could anchor myself to. But predictability is rarely offered to women like me. Older, tired, still carrying the scars of earlier battles, but expected to withstand whatever comes without complaint. As the baby grew, the house began to feel smaller, not physically, but in the way responsibilities take up space, expanding into every corner until there was no room left for the person you once were. My friends, the few I still had, came less frequently. They brought casseroles and soft blankets and stories of their grandchildren's school plays, and for a brief moment I felt held by their presence. But when they left, when the door clicked shut behind them and the house returned to its new rhythm of neediness and renewal, I realized that their lives were moving in directions mine had already passed. They had leisure now, book clubs, vacations, hobbies rediscovered, while I had stepped backward into a stage of life I had never expected to revisit. I did not resent them. I simply felt the quiet understanding that my path had diverged from theirs, not by choice, but by circumstance, and that there was no map to bring me back. At night, when the baby finally slept, I would stand at the window and look out at the dark stretch of a desert beyond the yard. The silence of the land always held a kind of truth that people were too loud to offer. The stars were sharp, unwavering, arranged in patterns that had existed long before my troubles and would exist long after. And yet even that ancient stillness couldn't quiet the questions circling my mind like restless birds. Had my daughter ever intended to return? Had she imagined I would raise her child? Had she assumed the world would take care of what she couldn't face? And maybe the hardest question of all, why didn't she trust me enough to ask for help before choosing abandonment? As the months passed, a new tension grew, not in dramatic bursts, but in slow, suffocating increments. It began with paperwork, requests for documentation, letters from state offices, reminders that guardianship was still temporary, that decisions could still shift, that nothing was certain until it was signed and stamped and filed by hands far removed from the reality of midnight feedings and doctor visits. Some of the letters were phrased in ways that made me feel watched, evaluated, judged, according to criteria written by people who had probably never raised a child alone at 74. They wanted proof of stability, proof of income, proof of medical clearance, proof of emotional readiness, proof, as if love itself were insufficient without bureaucratic validation. Even the baby sensed the undercurrent, I think. Children feel instability long before they understand it. Some days she cried in long, aching wails that seemed to come from a place deeper than hunger or discomfort, as if mourning something she could not name. Other days she clung to me with tiny fists, pulling at the fabric of my shirt, refusing to be put down even for a moment. I wondered if she carried some echo of her mother's absence inside her, a memory of loss imprinted before she knew what loss meant. The worst moments, the ones that tightened like a knot behind my ribs, were those when I allowed myself to imagine the future. What if my daughter returned unexpectedly, demanding answers? What if the county decided she had rights I could not contest? What if some distant relative appeared, eager to claim the child they had never seen but suddenly felt connected to? These thoughts circled my nights like wolves, silent but relentless, waiting for the smallest crack in my certainty. And yet, life did not collapse. Instead, it tightened. The baby grew heavier in my arms, her gaze more insistent, her cries more articulate in their need. The world around me narrowed to the essential: feed her, bathe her, comfort her, protect her. Day by day, my identity shifted without my consent. I was no longer simply a mother to a daughter who had slipped away. I was now the anchor of a new life, a life that depended entirely on my ability to stand steady, despite everything pulling at me. This wasn't a sudden transformation. It was a quiet accumulation of moments, each one adding its own weight to the realization that my daughter's absence was not temporary, not accidental, not reversible. It was a choice she had made long before she left the box on my porch, a choice I had refused to see until the consequences lay sleeping in my arms. By the time the baby turned 6 months old, the truth had settled into me with the calmness of inevitability. Nothing dramatic needed to happen for the situation to worsen. The true escalation was the slow erosion of hope, the quiet settling of responsibility, the growing awareness that my daughter's return, if it ever came, would not be a reunion, but a reckoning. I told myself that as long as I kept moving, kept caring, kept loving, I could hold everything together. But deep inside, I knew the truth. The real breaking point wasn't loud. It was already happening, in silence, in me. It happened so gradually that I did not recognize it at first. The shift from merely enduring the days to making a choice that would reshape the rest of my life. For months I had lived in a suspended state, caught between fear and obligation, feeling as though every decision I made for the baby belonged to someone else who simply hadn't arrived yet to claim her. I fed her, held her, soothed her, rocked her. But part of me kept waiting for my daughter to appear at the door, contrite or furious or trembling or indifferent, but present. That waiting became a habit, then a burden, then a quiet poison that diluted every joy I might have felt. I realized the weight of it one afternoon when the baby, almost a year old now, with soft curls gathering at the back of her head, took her first steps between the coffee table and my knees. She fell into my hands with a startled laugh, delighted with herself. And yet the moment struck me not with joy, but with a muted ache. Because the first person I imagined telling wasn't my daughter, but a version of her that no longer existed, someone I had been hoping to resurrect out of memory alone. That realization landed in me with the heaviness of a truth that has been waiting too long to be acknowledged. It was that same week that I received a letter from the county, a thin envelope folded at the corners from the rough handling of mail carriers. The language was formal and unsentimental, informing me that the temporary guardianship period was coming to its close and that a determination needed to be made regarding the child's long-term placement. They asked whether I intended to seek permanent guardianship or if I believed reunification with the biological mother was possible and preferable. The letter felt like a test I already knew the answer to, but did not want to write down. I laid it on the kitchen table, the baby in her high chair tapping a spoon against the tray, unaware that the world could shift from a single sheet of paper. I read the letter twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder, something simpler. But the words remained still, waiting for me to stop pretending that hope was anything more than a shadow. That night, I sat awake long after the baby had fallen asleep, the desert wind slipping around the house the way doubt slips around the heart. I made myself a cup of tea and held it between my palms, letting the warmth seep into my skin as though it might steady me. I thought about my daughter in a way I had avoided for months, not as the girl I raised, not as the child who once clung to my leg on the first day of school, not as the teen who slammed doors and insisted she needed no one, but as the adult who left, her newborn on my porch without a word. I had spent too long searching for softness in a memory that had grown sharp. There was grief in admitting that I no longer knew who she was, but there was also relief, as if the truth, painful as it was, finally allowed me to stop begging old ghosts to behave like living women. I realized then that the future of the baby could not rest on the unpredictable whims of a woman who had not shown up for her own life in years. It had to rest on me, not because I was the only one available, but because I was the only one who had stayed, the only one who had stepped forward instead of running. I felt something settle inside me. Not courage, not determination exactly, but a kind of knowing, the kind that comes when denial finally loosens its grip. I understood that love is not measured by biological ties or promises made in moments of reprieve. It is measured by presence, by consistency, by the willingness to choose someone even when it is inconvenient or frightening or lonely. And I had chosen this child from the moment I lifted her out of that box, long before I realized the choice was mine alone. The next morning, I dressed the baby and placed her in the stroller, not with the hesitance of someone still unsure, but with a calm that surprised me. I walked to the legal aid office downtown, past the pottery shops and the tourists with cameras, past the street vendors selling turquoise bracelets and roasted corn, past the mural of the desert sky painted across a brick wall. I had lived in Taos long enough to know these streets by heart, yet they felt different that day, steadier, as if they were guiding me rather than the other way around. The receptionist looked up from her desk and asked if I had an appointment. I told her no, but that I was ready to make one. The words felt strange in my mouth, heavier than they should have been. But when she nodded and handed me a form, I knew there was no turning back. Sitting in the waiting room, filling out paperwork that asked for information about my health, my finances, my living situation, I felt exposed in a way I hadn't felt in years. It is an unsettling thing to list your weaknesses on a government form, to quantify your limitations as though you were submitting proof of your inadequacy. But as I wrote, I realized I was not listing failures. I was outlining the life I had built despite them. I wrote honestly, without embellishment or apology. When the attorney finally met with me, a woman with silver-streaked hair and the kind of gaze that sees everything, I told her the truth, that I wanted permanent guardianship, that I wanted stability for the child, that I could no longer bear the weight of waiting for a daughter who might never return. She listened without interrupting, her hands folded neatly on the desk. When I finished, she nodded once and said, "It's time to make this official." There was no judgment in her voice, only recognition, as though she had guided many women through the same quiet reckoning. Her calmness steadied me in a way I didn't know I needed. She outlined the process, the steps we would take, the documents we would need, the possible complications. It was daunting, far more complex than I had imagined, but instead of fear, I felt a strange sense of peace. The kind that comes when you finally begin walking in the direction your life has been nudging you toward for months. When I left the office, the sun was high, casting long, clean lines across the plaza. The baby slept in her stroller, her eyelids fluttering, her cheeks warm from the afternoon light. I paused for a moment to watch her, the weight of what I had done settling, not like a burden, but like the foundation of something steady. I knew the decision would come with challenges, that the process might drag on for months, that questions would be asked and documents scrutinized. But deep down, beneath the fear and the uncertainty, there was a quiet certainty. This was the step I had been avoiding out of misplaced loyalty to a daughter who had made her choices long before I acknowledged mine. And in that moment, standing at the edge of the plaza with the stroller beneath my hands, I felt the shift fully, undeniably. I was no longer waiting. I was moving. I was choosing. And for the first time since the night I found that cardboard box, I understood that the future did not have to arrive as something to survive. It could be something to build. The first sign that the past was beginning to circle back toward me did not come in the form of a letter or a phone call, but in something far smaller and far more human. A question asked by the child I had been raising for almost 18 years. A question I had expected at some point, but not on that particular morning when the sunlight was gentle and the world seemed almost cooperative. She was sitting at the kitchen table, tracing the grain of the wood with her fingertip, her eyes sharper than the ones I remembered from her toddler years, eyes that carried curiosity, but also caution, as though she had rehearsed the question many times before, daring to speak it aloud. She asked whether her mother had ever tried to contact us. She asked it without accusation, without bitterness, simply as someone who had begun to recognize the gaps in her own story. And I, who had spent her entire life walking the line between truth and protection, found myself answering with an honesty that felt both frightening and inevitable. I told her that her mother had not called, had not written, had not shown up in all the years we had built our world together. I watched her absorb that truth quietly, her face still, her breath steady. But there was a flicker in her eyes, a small tremor of grief mixed with the dawning strength of a young woman beginning to understand that absence is its own form of declaration. After that conversation, something shifted. Perhaps it was in her, perhaps in me, or perhaps in the delicate arrangement of fate that governs the moments when dormant stories decide to awaken. She became quieter in the evenings, reflective in a way that reminded me of my younger self, the version of me who used to stand at the window waiting for my husband to return from long shifts, wondering what choices become necessary when love begins to wear thin. She researched things on her phone, laws about abandoned children, records of birth certificates, stories of reunifications that went well and those that ended poorly. She did not tell me everything she found, but I noticed the way she carried herself more grounded, as though the truth I had offered her was not a wound, but a map. I tried not to worry. I told myself that the questions she asked were normal, that every child eventually seeks the shape of the void that exists in their life. But beneath that reassurance sat a faint unease, a sense that something had been stirred that could not be easily calmed again. The second sign arrived not through her, but through the mail, though I did not recognize it as a sign at first. It was a printed newsletter meant for residents of the county, a thin packet of community updates and policy reminders that I typically skimmed before setting aside. But near the end, tucked between a notice about water restrictions and an announcement for a local arts fair, was a small section detailing new initiatives for locating parents in cases of unresolved child abandonment. It mentioned a collaboration between agencies, the expansion of databases, and a renewed effort to address old cases. Most people would have read it with no more than passing interest. But for me, it was as if someone had tapped an old bruise and reminded me that injuries do not always heal cleanly. My daughter had vanished without a trace nearly 2 decades ago. The world had moved on. I had allowed myself to believe she had simply dissolved into the broad anonymity cities grant to those who wish to disappear. Yet here, printed in unemotional bureaucratic language, was the suggestion that the system had begun searching again, not for her necessarily, but for all those ghosts who had walked away from their responsibilities. I set the newsletter down, tried to shake off the feeling that the walls of my house had grown slightly tighter, as though preparing for something I could not yet name. The third sign, however, was unmistakable. It came on a Friday afternoon in early spring, when the air smelled faintly of juniper, and the child I had raised, almost grown now, was preparing for a study group. She left the house with her backpack slung over one shoulder, promising to be home by dinner. I watched her walk down the path with the steady confidence I had spent years nurturing, and then turned back to the task of chopping vegetables for the stew. When the knock came, it was sharp enough to interrupt the quiet rhythm of the knife on the cutting board. I expected a neighbor or perhaps a delivery driver. Instead, when I opened the door, I found a man in a suit standing on my porch, his posture perfectly balanced, his expression politely unreadable. He introduced himself by name, a name that meant nothing to me, but the second sentence knocked the air from my chest. He represented my daughter. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. My daughter. Represented. The words felt fragile and implausible, like a lie told by someone who had no knowledge of the weight they carried. He held a briefcase in one hand and extended the other toward me as though we were business acquaintances meeting for a negotiation. I did not take his hand. I asked him what he wanted. He said he had been sent to discuss custodial considerations. The phrase was so clinical, so distant from the truth of what had transpired, that I felt a sudden rush of heat behind my eyes. I asked where my daughter was. He said she was not present, but intended to be involved in future discussions. I asked why she had surfaced now. He replied that he could not disclose personal motivations, only that she wished to re-establish a relationship with her biological child. Something inside me tightened at that phrasing, the same way a muscle tightens when pushed beyond its endurance. Biological child. As if biology had been the measure of anything she had done. As if being the source of someone's blood could erase years of absence or overwrite the sleepless nights and medical appointments and heartbreaks I had carried alone. I asked him whether she had read the guardianship documents, whether she understood the permanence of the arrangement. He smiled in that precise, rehearsed way attorneys do, when their job requires them to remain calm in the presence of justified fury. He said that circumstances could always be reviewed, that the courts sometimes reconsider, that the biological parent has rights if they choose to pursue them. I felt my breath catch in my throat, not out of fear, but out of something older, deeper. The familiar recognition that the past was no longer content to remain behind me. He handed me an envelope. Inside were papers requesting a mediation meeting, a formal session to discuss future arrangements. The date was printed neatly at the top, only 2 weeks away. When I looked back up, he was still standing there, polite, waiting for acknowledgement. I told him I would review the documents and contact my attorney. The slight surprise on his face told me he had not expected me to already have legal representation, as though he had assumed I was a woman who simply reacted to life rather than preparing for it. He nodded and left with the deliberate steps of someone who has disrupted the life of another and feels nothing more than the satisfaction of completing a task. After he drove away, I stood on the porch for a long moment, my hands trembling not from fear but from fury, so controlled it felt like ice in my veins. I went inside, closed the door, and sat down at the kitchen table. I opened the envelope again, reading each line slowly, methodically, as though the words might change if I blinked too quickly. They did not. They remained steady and indifferent. My daughter wanted mediation. My daughter planned to return. My daughter wished to reassess parental connection. When my granddaughter returned home that evening, I did not tell her immediately. I watched her move around the kitchen, unaware of the storm gathering in the corners of the room, her face flushed with the warmth of friendship and the beginnings of adulthood. I realized with a heaviness that pressed deep into my ribs that I would have to tell her soon, that she deserved to know, that avoiding the truth would only deepen the eventual wound. But I waited for the right moment, the right stillness in the air, the right calm in her eyes. When I finally told her 2 days later, she listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable at first. Then she asked a question so soft I almost missed it. Why now? I had no answer, only the same question circling inside me with growing intensity. Over the next 2 weeks, the air in the house thickened. My granddaughter moved through her days with an uneasy focus, going to school, studying, returning home. But each night, she sat at the table with a pen in her hand, writing something she never allowed me to see. I assumed she was preparing herself, emotionally, mentally, for a confrontation she had never imagined she would have to face. Meanwhile, I contacted my attorney, who listened calmly as I explained everything. She sighed, not out of frustration, but out of recognition, as though she had expected that once the girl reached adulthood, the mother would resurface. She told me we would prepare, that nothing would happen without our full consent, that the law could protect what love had built. But the truth was that the legal process was only one part of the escalation. The emotional terrain was shifting beneath us in ways I had not fully anticipated. I found myself reviewing old memories of my daughter. Her laughter as a child, her stubbornness as a teen, her unpredictable disappearances in her 20s. I wondered whether there was something in her that had always been searching for escape, something restless and unanchored. I wondered whether she had waited 18 years to return because she believed time would soften the edges of her choices. I wondered whether she thought my granddaughter would greet her with longing rather than caution. The questions gnawed at me at night, reminding me that the past is never as distant as one hopes. On the morning of the mediation, my granddaughter sat beside me in the car, her hands steady in her lap, her jaw set in a firm line I recognized as her father's expression, though she had never known him. When we entered the building, I felt a strange mixture of dread and resolve, as though I were crossing a threshold into the part of my life where truth no longer allowed room for illusion. My daughter arrived 5 minutes late, looking polished and composed, standing beside the attorney who had visited my home. She greeted us with a smile that did not reach her eyes. My granddaughter looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw a flicker of recognition, not of love, but of clarity. She saw the woman who had left her behind. She saw the stranger who wanted something she had never helped build. And in that moment, in that stillness before anyone spoke, I understood that the past had not simply returned. It was demanding to be reckoned with. I had imagined the moment of confrontation 100 different ways over the years, always thinking it would come with shouting or tears or a kind of desperate clinging to the past. But when it finally arrived, it unfolded with a quietness so deep it felt almost ceremonial, like something ancient being drawn out of hiding. The mediator's office was small, windowless, lit by the kind of fluorescent bulbs that give everything a slightly washed-out appearance, as though the room itself encouraged people to speak without embellishment. My granddaughter sat beside me, her back straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap, but I could feel the tension humming just beneath her composure, a vibration that matched the one in my own chest. When my daughter entered the room, she moved with the confident steps of someone who had rehearsed her entrance, someone who believed that her return would carry the weight of significance simply because she had finally chosen to appear. She greeted the room with a practiced smile that softened only slightly when her eyes landed on my granddaughter. In that moment, I watched both of them closely, my daughter searching for recognition, and my granddaughter, searching for truth. The look that passed between them was not the spark of long-lost connection I think my daughter had hoped for. It was something far more honest, something fragile and almost painful in its clarity. My granddaughter saw a stranger trying to step into a role she had not earned. My daughter saw a young woman who no longer needed what she had once refused to give. The mediator began with gentle explanations about the purpose of the session, the importance of hearing all sides, the need for respectful communication. But her voice drifted into the background as my daughter launched into a polished account of her disappearance and her sudden re-entry into our lives. She spoke about the hardships of her 20s, about the confusion and instability, the relationships that left her drained, the jobs that took her across state lines and then vanished beneath her feet. She described the night she left the baby on my porch as a moment of overwhelming fear, a kind of collapse she felt powerless to stop. She insisted that she had not intended the separation to last forever, that she had spent years thinking about reconnecting, but that shame had kept her silent. It was a well-crafted monologue, one that highlighted vulnerability without ever fully surrendering responsibility, and I could see the careful architecture of it, the way each detail had been chosen to elicit sympathy without inviting scrutiny. When she finished, the mediator nodded and turned to me, asking if I wished to respond. I felt my granddaughter shift slightly in her seat, a silent reassurance that she was with me no matter what I said. I took a slow breath and allowed myself to speak not as someone defending a possession, but as someone defending a truth. I explained the years of silence that followed that night on the porch, the countless documents I filed, the medical forms I signed, the milestones I witnessed alone. I described the fevers, the tantrums, the first day of school, the heartbreaks of adolescence, the triumphs that belonged solely to the two of us who remained when the world had gone quiet. I spoke of the nights when the child clung to me, trembling with dreams she could not articulate, and the days when she asked about her mother with the softness of hope that has not yet learned caution. I did not accuse, I simply recounted. And in the recounting, the truth stood so plainly that even the mediator's expression shifted from neutrality to something like sorrow. My daughter listened with an expression that wavered between impatience and discomfort, as though she wished the story would hurry to a part that presented her in a kinder light. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried an edge sharper than before, an attempt to reclaim footing. She insisted she was ready now, that she had stability, that she was capable of offering the child, no, the young woman, opportunities I could not. She talked about resources, education funds, the kind of financial promises that meant little compared to the 18 years of lived experience she had abandoned. She said she wanted a relationship, that she deserved a chance to repair what she had broken. Before I could respond, my granddaughter placed her hand gently on my arm, signaling that she wanted to speak. The room grew still in a way that made even the fluorescent lights seem to hum more softly. She addressed the mediator first, then my daughter, her voice steady, but threaded with a quiet power I had seen emerging in her for years. She said that she did not harbor resentment for the past, because resentment required a kind of relationship they had never shared. She said that she understood people make mistakes, even terrible ones, but that understanding did not automatically open the door to reunion. She explained, with a clarity that stunned even me, that love is not something that grows automatically from shared DNA, nor does abandonment become forgiven simply because time has passed. Then she looked directly at her mother and said words that settled into every corner of that room like a declaration etched into stone. She said that she did not need a relationship with someone who had chosen absence over effort, someone who had appeared only after the hard parts of raising her were finished. She said that her home, her history, and her life were with me, and that attempting to rewrite the narrative now felt less like love and more like intrusion. She told her mother that she wished her well, truly, but that she would not be stepping into a bond that had never existed. The silence that followed was dense and heavy, stretching so long that even the mediator hesitated to break it. My daughter's expression shifted in an instant, from carefully maintained composure to something like disbelief, as though she had imagined her return would prompt gratitude or longing, not the clear-eyed boundary of a young woman who had learned to define her own worth. She said my granddaughter was too young to understand the complexity of motherhood, that she was being influenced, that she needed time to explore the possibility of connection. But the words landed with a hollow clang, out of rhythm with the truth that had just been spoken. When the mediator finally concluded the session, she noted that the request for reinstating parental rights had no foundation, given the legal history and the expressed wishes of the now adult child. She said that unless something changed dramatically, the matter would not proceed further. My daughter protested weakly, then more sharply, but the decision was already taking shape in the room, firm and undeniable. As we stood to leave, my daughter reached out, calling my granddaughter's name with a tremor that might have been genuine or might have been the shock of realizing that time had not waited for her. My granddaughter paused, turned, and offered a simple nod, polite, respectful, but final. There was no malice in her expression, only a maturity that comes from understanding that not all stories end with reconciliation, and not all wounds are meant to be reopened. When we walked out of that building, the sunlight hit us with a warmth that felt startling after the dimness of the mediation room. My granddaughter slipped her hand into mine, not out of dependence, but out of affirmation. And I knew, with a calmness that reached deeper than relief, that the most difficult part of the journey was behind us. The truth had been spoken, unfiltered and unshakable, and in that speaking, the power my daughter once held over our lives dissolved like dust carried off by the desert wind. In the days that followed, the house seemed to breathe differently, as if the walls themselves had been holding tension for years and were finally allowed to exhale. Nothing dramatic changed on the surface. My routines remained the same. The desert sky stretched wide and indifferent overhead. The kitchen filled with the familiar clatter of pots and the soft hum of the radio. But there was a quiet steadiness underneath everything now. The kind that comes only after a long-awaited truth has finally been spoken out loud. My granddaughter moved through the rooms with a new lightness in her step, not the superficial brightness of someone pretending to be unbothered, but the grounded presence of someone who had walked through a fire and emerged clear-eyed on the other side. She carried herself differently, not as a child hoping for answers, but as a young woman who had found them within herself. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and cast long golden streaks across the floor, she joined me on the porch where I sat with a book I wasn't really reading. The wind was gentle, stirring the sage and carrying with it that faint, earthy scent that always appears right before nightfall. She sank into the chair beside me with a soft sigh, the kind people make only when they have finally laid down a weight they have carried for too long. We didn't speak at first. We didn't need to. There are silences that echo with everything that no longer needs to be said, and this was one of them. Eventually, she told me she felt free, not because she had rejected her mother, but because she had chosen herself. She said she knew now that love could not be forced into existence, not even when people believed it should bloom naturally from blood. She said she understood that her mother's absence was not her fault, not a reflection of her worth, not a mistake she needed to correct. She said she was grateful for the life we had built, for the stability I had given her, for the truth that had shaped her, rather than the fantasy that would have swallowed her. I listened, my chest tightening with a mixture of grief and pride, and I realized that this was the moment I had been unknowingly working toward for 18 years. Not the confrontation, not the courtroom signatures, not the legal protections, but this simple, steady clarity in her voice. Later that night, after she went inside, I remained on the porch with my hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of tea. I watched the stars appear one by one, scattered across the sky like small, stubborn lights, refusing to be swallowed by the dark. I thought about my daughter, not with anger, not even with sorrow, but with a kind of soft distance, as though she were a character in a story whose path had branched so far from mine that there was no longer a bridge between us. I accepted then what I had resisted for years. Not every person who leaves needs to return, and not every return deserves a door held open. Some stories are not meant to circle back. Some stories simply end. I felt no triumph in what had happened. Victory is far too loud a word for something built on so many silences. What I felt instead was peace. The quiet kind that settles in the bones and whispers that nothing more is required of you, that the battles you fought have finally earned their rest. I thought of the night I found the cardboard box on my porch, the helpless sound the baby made inside it, the fear that curled through me like cold smoke. I thought of all the years between then and now, the nights spent pacing the hallway, the mornings filled with routines that anchored us to the world, the days when love felt heavy but necessary. And sitting there beneath the wide desert sky, I realized something I had never fully admitted. That child had not simply been left with me. She had been entrusted to me by circumstances neither of us chose. And I had done the best I could with what life handed me. Before going inside, I whispered something into the dark, not to my daughter, not even to myself, but to the version of the woman I once was, the woman who feared she was too old, too tired, too unprepared to raise another child. I told her she had done well. I told her she had carried what needed carrying. I told her she was allowed now to rest. And finally, as I reached the doorway, I thought of all the women who live in the shadow of someone else's choices, the women who pick up what others drop, who raise children left behind, who stitch together families out of scraps of loyalty and necessity. If any of them were standing beside me, I would tell them what I learned only at the very end. You are not defined by who abandoned you or by whom you had to save. You are defined by who you became in the quiet, persistent work of loving someone who depended on you. And that, more than any title or bloodline or legal document, is what endures. Then I stepped inside, closed the door gently behind me, and felt, for the first time in many years, that the story had finally settled into its rightful ending.